Welcome to our deep dive into the world of Alexander of Aphrodisias. He's a philosopher who, you know, even though he lived in the shadow of these big names like Aristotle and Plato, he still made these huge contributions to philosophy that we still talk about today.
Yeah.
You might be thinking, why should I care about some ancient philosopher?
Right.
But trust me, Alexander tackled some seriously head-scratching concepts that philosophers are still debating today. We're talking about free will, the nature of the soul, and even the very basics of how we understand the universe.
Yeah, that's what's so cool about philosophy. It's timeless. These aren't just dusty old ideas. They're fundamental questions about what is reality and how do we fit into it all.
Right.
And Alexander, as a commentator on Aristotle, had this unique challenge of not only explaining some of the most complex philosophical ideas ever written, but he also had to defend them against these rival schools of thought, like the Stoics.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so we're about to get deep into some philosophy here.
Right.
But I promise, we'll make it interesting.
We'll try.
And speaking of interesting, let's start with the man himself, Alexander. The sources we have suggest that we know surprisingly little about his personal life.
Yeah, it's true. His life is kind of a mystery. The most concrete information we have is from the dedication of his work on fate. He dedicated it to the Roman emperors Septimius Severus and Caracalla.
Okay.
And that places him, roughly in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries CE. But beyond that, the details are pretty scarce.
So he's a man of mystery.
A little bit.
But he's often called the commentator.
Right.
So was that all he did? Just explain Aristotle.
He was the commentator on Aristotle. I mean, that's no small feat. Imagine trying to explain Aristotle's metaphysics. Talk about a brain workout. But his commentaries, they weren't just summaries. He really dove deep into Aristotle's thought. He was clarifying arguments, filling in gaps, and even defending Aristotle against, those other philosophical heavyweights like the Stoics.
Oh, wow. That sounds like a real philosophical battle royale.
Oh, yeah.
But it seems like he really believed in the power of Aristotle's philosophy.
Absolutely. He saw Aristotle's philosophy as like a complete system, a unified way of understanding everything, from logic and metaphysics to psychology and ethics. And he even went so far as to try to smooth over any apparent contradictions in Aristotle's work. He'd say, well, any inconsistencies are probably due to our limited understanding rather than flaws in Aristotle's thinking.
So he was a true Aristotelian through and through. Mm-hmm. But how did his work fit into the bigger picture of ancient philosophy? Was he just keeping Aristotle's, flame alive?
Right.
Or did he bring something new to the table?
Well, I think it's fair to say he was a bridge between the past and the future of philosophy. He was the last major commentator on Aristotle before the rise of Neoplatonism, which was this school of thought that tried to synthesize the ideas of Plato and Aristotle. So Alexander's work played a key role in, preserving Aristotle's legacy, but also engaging with the evolving philosophical landscape of his time.
Okay, so we've got this brilliant commentator. But what about his own philosophical contributions? Where did he really shine? Our sources point to 4 main areas.
Yeah.
Logic, metaphysics, psychology, and then his views on ethics and fate. Let's start with logic. What makes his approach to logic stand out?
Well, for a philosopher, what's really fascinating is how Alexander grappled with the, those advancements in logic that happened after Aristotle, particularly those contributions of the Stoics. He didn't just dismiss their ideas. He actually tried to integrate aspects of Stoic logic into his own understanding of Aristotle.
Okay.
So, for example, he would discuss the Stoic concept of indemonstrables, as if they were actually an invention of Aristotle himself.
So he wasn't afraid to, borrow from other schools of thought?
No, not at all. He saw value in the Stoic contributions, but he ultimately believed that Aristotle's system was just more comprehensive and consistent. He was trying to show how the Stoics were actually just building upon Aristotle's foundation. He even used Stoic terminology to describe those logical relations, of effectively kind of merging their approach with Aristotle's.
That's a pretty clever way to reconcile those different approaches.
Right.
But did he always agree with the Stoics, Or were there, like, some fundamental disagreements there?
Oh, there were definitely points of contention. One example is his discussion of a new kind of premise. The premise, not only at a certain instant in time, he used this to describe the essential properties of things, which, Aristotle called propria.
Right.
The Stoics had their own way of defining propria, but Alexander argued that their approach actually led to inconsistencies, and that Aristotle's method, with this new kind of premise, was more accurate and philosophically sound.
So it sounds like he was really trying to fine-tune Aristotle's system to make it even more precise and rigorous.
I think that's a great way to put it.
Okay. Let's shift gears now and dive into the deep end of metaphysics.
Great.
What were some of those big metaphysical questions that Alexander tackled?
One of the central issues he grappled with was whether metaphysics could actually be a demonstrative science, like geometry or astronomy.
Okay.
Aristotle had argued that metaphysics, as the study of being qua being, had its own unique subject matter and principles, but he didn't really fully develop this idea of metaphysics as a demonstrative science. So Alexander took up the challenge and tried to show how metaphysics could actually meet those criteria, those rigorous criteria.
So he was essentially trying to prove that metaphysics wasn't just, like, airy-fairy speculation, but a legitimate science with its own methods and principles.
Exactly. He argued that metaphysics has a clearly defined subject matter, which is being qua being, which refers to, well, everything that exists simply because it exists. And he also elaborated on the concept of, common notions, which Aristotle and the Stoics had talked about. These are kind of shared starting points for inquiry.
Wait, hold on. Can you explain what common notions are? It sounds a bit vague.
Sure. So think of common notions as like the basic building blocks of thought.
Yeah.
The idea that something can't both be and not be at the same time and in the same respect.
Right.
These are fundamental principles that, everybody, not just philosophers, uses to make sense of the world. Alexander argued that these common notions could serve as the axioms, the fundamental principles of metaphysics, and he actually expanded the concept of common notions. He incorporated features of, both dialectical starting points and scientific axioms, arguing that these common notions they're self-evident and they serve as the foundation for all of our metaphysical knowledge.
So he's grounding metaphysics in these fundamental truths that are accessible to everyone.
Right.
That's a pretty bold move. But can you give me a concrete example of a common notion that Alexander uses in metaphysics?
Sure. The principle of non-contradiction is a prime example. This principle, according to Alexander, isn't something that we learn from experience. It's a fundamental truth that's immediately evident to all rational beings. It's a bedrock principle that underpins our entire understanding of reality.
Okay, so he's not just talking about abstract concepts. He's trying to connect metaphysics to our basic understanding of how the world works.
Right, exactly. And another common notion he emphasizes is the principle of maximal causality. This asserts that everything that comes into being has to have a complete and sufficient cause. He argues that this principle is essential for understanding the nature of causation and the relationship between cause and effect in the universe.
So he's building this whole system of metaphysics based on these common sense principles.
Oh, right.
It's like he's saying, look, metaphysics isn't some esoteric mystery.
Mm-hmm.
It's rooted in the way that we all think about the world.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes Alexander so compelling,
Yeah.
He's trying to bridge the gap between those abstract philosophical concepts and our, everyday experience of reality.
Okay, I'm ready for the next philosophical adventure. Let's talk about psychology. What were Alexander's views on the soul and the mind?
Well, Alexander was very much an Aristotelian when it came to psychology. He argued that the soul is the form of the body. So this means that the soul isn't, a separate immaterial substance like Plato had argued, but rather it's the principle of organization and animation that, gives life and structure to the body.
So for Alexander, you're not a soul trapped in a body, but rather your soul is what makes your body uniquely you.
That's a great way to put it. And, this view presents a challenge. How do you affirm the soul's dependence on the body without reducing it to just, a mere physical attribute.
Right.
And Alexander's solution lies in his understanding of forms as causal powers.
Can you unpack that a bit for me?
Eh?
How do forms as causal powers solve this problem?
Well, he argued that, forms aren't just passive shapes or blueprints. They're active principles. They have this power to cause things to happen. So the soul, as the form of the body, is that causal power that enables the body to, to do all the things that it does, to grow, to sense, to think, and so on.
The soul isn't just a thing. It's a dynamic force. It's a principle of activity.
Precisely. And this leads us to one of the most fascinating and complex aspects of Alexander's psychology, his interpretation of Aristotle's ideas about the intellect.
Okay, now we're getting to the really juicy stuff. Just remind me, what was Aristotle's distinction between the passive intellect and the active intellect?
So Aristotle suggested that, the passive intellect is the part of our minds that receives information from the senses.
Okay.
And the active intellect is the part that processes that information. It abstracts universals from those particulars and makes judgments. So the big question is, how do these two intellects interact? And are they both actually part of the human mind? Or is the active intellect something separate, something maybe even divine?
Right, so what was Alexander's take on this? How did he interpret this distinction?
This is where things get really interesting. Alexander argues that the passive intellect, which he also calls the material intellect, is indeed part of the human soul. But he says that the active intellect is something transcendent and divine. So he essentially kind of, splits Aristotle's concept of the intellect into two distinct entities. This material intellect, it's tied to the body, it receives information from the senses, forms those images of particular things, but it's incapable of abstracting those universal concepts or engaging in higher level thinking on its own.
So we need this divine active intellect to really think.
Exactly. Alexander argues that the active intellect, being pure and immaterial, is the source of all true knowledge and understanding. It illuminates the passive intellect, allowing us to grasp universal concepts, form judgments, and engage in, philosophical contemplation. Think about how you learn something new. You first encounter the information through your senses, right?
Yeah.
That's the passive intellect at work. But to truly understand it, you need to, actively engage with it, make connections, see the bigger picture. And that's where the active intellect comes in.
That's a really helpful analogy.
Mm.
But how does this divine active intellect actually interact with our limited human minds?
Well, Alexander uses this fascinating phrase. He calls it the intellect from outside.
Okay.
He's drawing on an idea from Aristotle's, biological works, where Aristotle talks about the intellect as something that comes from outside that developing embryo.
Okay.
And Alexander takes this idea and gives it a metaphysical twist, He argues that the active intellect is always present. It's always thinking. It's always in this state of pure actuality. It's the ultimate source of all intelligibility, like the light that shines on our potential to think.
Oh, I'm really intrigued by this idea. Can you tell me more about how this connection with the divine intellect actually works in practice?
Well, when we engage in intellectual activity, when we grasp those universal concepts and contemplate the nature of reality, we are, in a sense, connecting with this divine intellect.
Okay.
It's through this connection that we're able to transcend our limited material existence and participate in something that's eternal and divine.
So it's like the active intellect is a beacon, and our passive intellects are drawn to its light, allowing us to see the world in a new way.
That's a beautiful way to put it.
This is fascinating stuff. It seems like Alexander is suggesting a theory of divine illumination hidden within Aristotle's work.
It's possible.
But wait a minute, this is a pretty radical interpretation, isn't it? Don't other philosophers disagree with Alexander's reading of Aristotle?
You're right. Not everyone agrees with his interpretation. Some scholars see it as a departure from Aristotle, while others argue that it's a faithful development of Aristotle's, core ideas. It's a debate that, continues to this day.
Well, that's the beauty of philosophy. There's always room for debate and different perspectives. But speaking of debates, I know Alexander was known for his sharp criticisms of the Stoics, particularly on the issue of fate.
Oh, yeah. That's right. And that brings us to his remarkable treatise on fate,
Okay.
which is, considered one of the most comprehensive surviving documents in that ancient debate on fate, determinism, and free will.
Okay, so what was his beef with the Stoics? What was at stake in this debate?
Well, the Stoics, with their emphasis on a divinely ordered cosmos, they held this strong deterministic view. They believed that everything that happens is preordained by, a divine plan. And this raised all sorts of questions about human freedom, responsibility, the meaning of life. And Alexander, as a champion of Aristotelian thought, took issue with this deterministic worldview.
So how did he argue against the Stoics? Did he just, like, deny the existence of fate altogether?
No, he didn't deny fate entirely, but he kind of redefined it in a way that was consistent with Aristotelian philosophy. He identified fate with nature, with those regular and orderly processes of the natural world.
Can you give me a concrete example of how this natural fate differs from the Stoic concept of fate?
Sure. Think about the life cycle of a plant. A seed, given the right conditions, will naturally grow into a certain kind of plant.
Right.
That's its fate, so to speak. But that doesn't mean that every detail of its growth is predetermined. It's still subject to, chance events like a sudden frost or a hungry animal.
So there's room for contingency within this natural order.
Exactly. And Alexander argues that, human beings, like plants, we have a certain nature. We have a set of potentialities that shape our lives. We have certain inclinations, talents, limitations that influence our choices and actions. But this doesn't mean that, our lives are completely determined. We still have free will.
Yeah.
That capacity to make choices that aren't simply dictated by our nature or by those external forces.
So it's this delicate balance between nature and freedom.
Precisely. And this is where Alexander's critique of the Stoics gets really interesting.
Okay.
He argues that their deterministic view undermines the very possibility of human freedom and responsibility.
Right.
If everything is preordained, then our deliberations, our choices, our efforts to, live a virtuous life, all of it becomes meaningless. We're just puppets dancing on the strings of fate.
That's a pretty bleak outlook.
Yeah.
No wonder he wanted to push back against that.
Yeah, and he does so with a lot of philosophical firepower. He dismantles those Stoic arguments piece by piece. He challenges their concept of contingency, chance, possibility. He shows how their deterministic framework leads to all these logical inconsistencies. He even argues that their concept of divine foreknowledge is incoherent if it implies a rigid determinism.
Wow, he's really taking the Stoics to task. It sounds like he's defending a view of human freedom that's quite modern in some ways.
Absolutely. He argues that truly free action requires this ability to do otherwise. That at the moment of choice, it's open to us to choose differently. And this is a view that many philosophers still hold today. And it's a testament to Alexander's philosophical insight that he was, grappling with these complex issues almost 2,000 years ago.
It's truly remarkable how these ancient philosophers were wrestling with questions that are still relevant to us today. But we've covered a lot of ground in this first part of our deep dive. We've explored Alexander's life, his role as a commentator and his contributions to logic, metaphysics, and psychology.
Yeah.
But there's still so much more to uncover.
Yeah.
Right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. When we return, we'll delve deeper into Alexander's thoughts on ethics, exploring his views on pleasure, pain, and how his understanding of human nature kind of informs his approach to living a good life.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Alexander of Aphrodisias. Before the break, we were talking about Alexander's powerful arguments against Stoic determinism, and of course his defense of human freedom.
I just love how he creates this intricate tapestry of philosophical thought, honoring Aristotle but weaving in his own really unique insights. It's amazing how he navigates all those complex debates but still makes it all relevant to the big questions, like how we should actually live.
And that's a key point. Alexander wasn't just some armchair philosopher, lost in these abstract theories.
He was really concerned with practical ethics, How should our philosophical understanding of the world actually inform our daily lives?
So he wasn't just a theorist. He was trying to figure out how these big ideas could actually help people live better lives. That makes me curious about how all of his philosophical views shaped his approach to ethics.
Yeah.
Did he have any specific ethical teachings or principles?
Well, he didn't exactly lay out a systematic ethical framework, like some other philosophers did.
Okay.
But his views on pleasure and pain, they offer a really fascinating glimpse into his ethical thinking.
That's interesting. How did Alexander approach those age-old questions, about pleasure and pain?
Yeah.
Did he like side with the Epicureans who saw pleasure as the ultimate good,
Well,
or the Stoics who, viewed it with more suspicion.
Well, he carved out a much more nuanced position, actually.
Oh.
Building on Aristotle's idea that pleasure is like a natural accompaniment to virtuous activity, he argues that pleasure is a kind of supervenient good,
A supervenient good.
meaning that it arises from the proper functioning of, our natural capacities.
Okay.
It's not the goal of the activity itself, but it's like a natural and desirable byproduct.
Can you give me like an example of what that looks like in practice?
Sure. Imagine like a skilled artisan,
Right.
someone who's spent
Yeah.
years mastering their craft. When they create something, that's both beautiful and functional, they experience a sense of satisfaction and joy, right?
Right.
That pleasure isn't the primary aim of their work. It emerges naturally from that like excellent exercise of their skill.
So it's kind of like a reward for doing what we're designed to do,
Yeah.
for living in accordance with our nature.
Exactly. And Alexander believed that this applies not just to, like skilled activities, but to every aspect of human life. When we exercise our rational faculties well, when we make virtuous choices, when we, nurture healthy relationships, we experience this deep sense of well-being and fulfillment.
Right.
Pleasure in this sense is an indication that we're flourishing, as human beings.
That's a much more appealing view of pleasure than just, chasing those fleeting sensations.
Right.
But what about pain? Did Alexander see pain as something to be like avoided at all costs?
Well, this is where his analysis gets really insightful, I think.
Okay.
He argues that pain, like pleasure, can be a natural accompaniment to activity, but in this case, it signals that something's wrong, that we're acting in a way that's harmful or contrary to our nature.
So pain can actually be a valuable teacher, like a guide to help us course correct.
Precisely. Think about like the pain of a physical injury.
Right.
It's not pleasant.
Yeah.
But it alerts us to a problem, something needs attention. And the same principle applies to our moral and emotional lives. Feelings of guilt or shame can indicate that, maybe we've acted in a way that violates our values or harms others.
This is making me rethink my whole like relationship with pain. It's not just something to be endured or numbed. It can actually be a source of valuable information.
Yeah.
A guide to living a better life.
That's a key takeaway, I think, from Alexander's ethics. He sees pleasure and pain not as like arbitrary sensations, but as meaningful signals that can help us to understand ourselves and live in a way that promotes our flourishing.
This really sheds new light on ancient ethics for me.
Yeah.
It's not just about rigid rules, but it's about, understanding human nature and seeking to live in harmony with it.
And that's what makes Alexander's philosophy so enduring. He's not just a commentator, he's a thinker, grappling with these fundamental questions about reality, the human mind, the good life, and his ideas, they were forged in the crucible of those ancient debates, and they still have the power to illuminate our own search for meaning and purpose.
It's been an incredible journey so far, exploring, the life and thought of this remarkable philosopher. We've covered his contributions to logic, metaphysics, psychology. We even delved into his fascinating perspective on ethics.
And in the final part of our deep dive, we're gonna tackle one of his most significant contributions to metaphysics.
Yeah.
His theory of prime matter.
Okay.
Get ready to explore the very foundation of reality, at least how Alexander saw it.
Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of Alexander of Aphrodisias.
Yeah.
So far we've been on this incredible journey through his unique perspectives on logic. We wrestled with his ideas about the soul and the intellect, and we even got to explore his really insightful perspective on ethics.
Yeah, and now we're ready to venture into the very heart of Alexander's metaphysics. Get ready to explore one of his most significant and really influential contributions, his theory of prime matter. This is where Alexander really digs deep, taking Aristotle's concept of matter and developing it into a really sophisticated system.
Okay, I think I'm ready for the challenge. But before we go any further, can we rewind a bit? Just remind me, what exactly is prime matter in the context of Aristotelian philosophy?
Sure. So, in Aristotle's view, everything in the physical world, it's composed of both matter and form, right?
Yeah.
Form is what gives a thing its specific shape, its structure, its properties. And matter is that underlying stuff that the form shapes. Think of a sculptor working with clay. The clay is the matter, and the sculptor's vision, the idea they're trying to express, that's the form.
Right, right. I remember that from Philosophy 101. But where does this prime matter fit into this picture?
So prime matter it's a bit more abstract.
Okay.
It's the most fundamental kind of matter, the underlying substrate that has the potential to take on any form. It's pure potentiality,
Yeah.
completely formless and undefined in itself.
So if regular matter is like the clay,
Hmm.
then prime matter is like the unshaped block of clay before the sculptor even like touches it.
Exactly. Prime matter is like that ultimate raw material, the stuff that all physical things are made of. But it doesn't have any inherent properties or characteristics. It only gains specific qualities when it's, shaped by a form.
Okay, okay. I think I'm starting to get it. But why is this concept of prime matter so important to Alexander? What makes it such a cornerstone of his metaphysics?
Well, for Alexander, prime matter is key to understanding how change is even possible.
Cool.
If everything was just a fixed and unchangeable form, then there would be no room for, growth or decay or transformation. But because prime matter is pure potentiality, it can take on new forms, allowing things to change and evolve over time.
So in a way, prime matter is like the engine of change in the universe.
Yeah.
It's what allows for all the diversity and the dynamic transformation that we see in the world around us.
That's a great way to put it. It provides that underlying continuity, the canvas upon which this ever-changing drama of existence unfolds. But prime matter's significance, it goes even deeper than that,
Yeah.
It plays a crucial role in Alexander's understanding of the relationship between the soul and the body, something we talked about earlier.
Now we're coming full circle.
Yeah.
How does prime matter help us understand that complex relationship?
Well, you'll recall that Alexander, following Aristotle, saw the soul as the form of the body, right?
Right.
But if the soul is a form, then what is it a form of? What's that underlying matter that the soul shapes and animates?
That's a great question. Is it prime matter?
Exactly. Alexander argues that the human body, though composed of, organs and tissues and cells, is ultimately reducible to prime matter.
Yeah.
It's this formless potential stuff that provides that substrate, that foundation for the soul to work on.
So prime matter bridges the physical and the metaphysical. It connects the material body and the immaterial soul.
Precisely. And this idea had, a real ripple effect throughout the history of philosophy and theology. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, for instance, drew upon Alexander's concept of prime matter to explain how the soul could interact with and shape the body without itself, being reduced to just a material thing.
It's mind-blowing to think that an ancient philosopher's ideas about matter could have such a profound impact on the course of intellectual history.
Yeah.
It really speaks volumes about the enduring power of philosophical inquiry,
Yeah.
to unravel the mysteries of existence.
Absolutely.
And it reinforces the fact that philosophy isn't just a relic of the past. These ancient thinkers were grappling with questions that are still relevant to us today. Their insights, even if they don't always provide those neat and tidy answers, they can challenge our assumptions and inspire us to think more deeply about our own lives and the world around us.
I think that's a really important point.
It's been an incredible journey, diving deep into the world of Alexander of Aphrodisias. We've explored his unique approach to logic. We've delved into his, intricate views on the soul and the intellect. We've grappled with his compelling arguments for free will, and we even uncovered his insightful perspective on ethics.
Yeah, and we've seen how his theory of prime matter, the seemingly simple concept, lies at the heart of his metaphysical system, providing the foundation for understanding change, causation, and even the relationship between the soul and the body.
What stands out to me is Alexander's commitment to rigorous thinking. And his ability to synthesize all these different strands of thought.
Mm-hmm.
He was a master at weaving together Aristotle's profound insights with his own original ideas. And he created this philosophical tapestry that's both, complex and compelling.
Yeah, he truly was a philosophical bridge, connecting the wisdom of the past with the questions of the present. And his influence continues to resonate throughout the history of philosophy.
As we wrap up our deep dive, I'm left with a renewed sense of wonder at the enduring power of philosophical inquiry.
Yeah.
These ancient ideas, They were sparked by debate and contemplation, but they still have the power to ignite our curiosity, challenge our perspectives, and illuminate our understanding of the world.
So the next time you find yourself pondering life's big questions, the nature of reality, the mysteries of the mind, or the meaning of existence, remember Alexander of Aphrodisias, the philosopher who walked in the shadow of giants, but whose own intellectual light continues to shine brightly across the centuries.
And perhaps, inspired by Alexander's deep dive into the heart of these philosophical questions, you'll embark on your own intellectual adventures. Explore those vast and uncharted territories of thought. Who knows what? What profound insights and discoveries await you on your own philosophical journey?